Okay. Hi. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Many of you know us, so I don't have to give a big introduction there. But as everyone knows, this is the 30th anniversary of the Oslo Accord that was signed at the White House lawn on September 13th, 1993. This was the Oslo Accord was something that was a big landmark event in the Middle East, as many of you know, bringing the two nationalist groups together in a way that was considered unthinkable. Israel and the PLO. Israel had viewed Yasser Arafat as an arch terrorist. The PLO had also equally disdainful views of Israel. And now it's 30 years since that famous handshake. The conflict appears as intractable as ever, with the Israeli government plowing ahead with some controversial political territorial policies, and the Palestinian Authority struggling to maintain legitimacy and control, and Hamas inciting further attacks. As 2023 shapes up to be the conflict's most violent year since the second intifada between 2000 and 2004. And various actors are now calling to jettison the Oslo framework entirely. We will also discuss the U.S. Saudi initiative that is likely to have a Palestinian component as we look ahead. But to discuss Oslo's past promise and its future prospects, the Washington Institute is pleased to announce this virtual policy forum with Neomi Neumann, al-Omari, Dennis Ross, and myself. Neomi is a visiting fellow at the Washington Institute. This is her maiden policy forum. She recently retired after nearly 3 decades of Israeli government service, including as head of the research unit of the Israeli security agency known as the Shin Bet or Shabak, and was a researcher also for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. al-Omari is certainly no stranger to this audience because he's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, the Institute's Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship. He formerly served as an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during the 1999 and 2001 permanent status talks. And of course, Ambassador Dennis Ross, a former special assistant to President Barack Obama, and was the U.S. Middle East coordinator, the special Middle East coordinator. And during the Clinton administration, he's a counselor at, and William Davidson, distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute. I, David Makovsky, am the director of the Koret Project on Arab-Israel relations. I wrote a book on Oslo called Making Peace with the PLO, the Rabin government's road to the Oslo Accords. I'm also an adjunct at SAIS, the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So why don't we just delve into it? We've got a lot of speakers and we have limited time. So we're asking each one to make like no more than 10 minutes of observations, and then we'll open it up. So I think it's fitting that we start with Neomi and on our first time, our first policy forum, and welcome to the Washington Institute. Neomi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and good morning or good evening, depending where you are. Regarding the Oslo Accord, I think that the interesting question is the Oslo Accord is valid and if it's relevant? So the answer is yes and no. I believe it's still valid, but on the other hand, it's not relevant for right now, for our period of time. We should look at the current situation and of the Palestinian Authority and Israel, and the situation is quite complicated. On one hand, contrary to the prediction, the Palestinian Authority is still functioning. It's a functioning authority that provides civilian service. Its economic situation, it's not good, but it's not so bad. And the security apparatus that undergoing professional training. So we have something that is addressed for the Palestinian, and in a way it's also addressed for the Israeli. On the other hand, we should say there is problematic relationship between the Palestinian Authority and Israel. There is disconnect between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Furthermore, even the security coordination is barely take place. So, and on top of all this, if someone wants to move forward in the political process, according to Oslo outline, there is no really possibility, because the political circumstance and the environment in the Israeli arena and in the Palestinian arena is very it's not convenient arena. So we need to ask ourselves, what should we do in order to promote or to write the second chapter of Oslo Accord? So I think that in order that it will be a peace process, we need three crucial components. One, we need brave leadership, which will be able to do painful decision. Second, we need that the people, the Palestinian public and the Israeli public, will give legitimation to their leadership in order to make this painful decision. And we need also that will be a kind of reality in which the actors that oppose to the peace process will be or weak or irrelevant. So when you look at our arena, unfortunately, we lack an courageous leadership in the Israeli side and also in the Palestinian side. Regarding the public, I think that both public, and this is the good aspect of this, both public want to be separate for each other. If you look at the polls, 85% of the Israeli citizens want that don't want the one-state solution, and 65% they don't want to rule over other people. Where is the problem? The problem is, and I think this is a huge problem that needs to be bridged, that while the Palestinian, after the second intifada, realize that violence doesn't bring necessarily political achievement, in the Israeli society, something the opposite way happened, which means the Israeli afraid that every time that you go to a negotiation and a peace process, in the end of the day, you face violence. And this is, as I said, something that must be bridged. So we talked about leadership and we talked about the public, and the third side of this triangle, along with the leadership and the public, is the actors who oppose to the political process. So in order to actually to go forward in this process, we need that these actors that oppose to the process will be or weak or irrelevant. Unfortunately, these elements in the Palestinian area and in Israel, they are still relevant. Furthermore, in the Israeli government, some of the people oppose to the peace processes, and this is something that is very important. So we understand we need to wait for some change in the leadership in the both arena. Now, one of the key point is the day after Abu Mazen. I think that the Palestinian must take a set of steps to ensure there will be a smooth transition in the arena. Otherwise, we'll be in kind of decline into the chaos. And this is something that the Palestinians need to do emergently. And another thing we need to know, that the weakness of the Palestinian Authority is partially because of internal sectoral problem. It's the inability to criticize themselves, the political stagnation, the government norms, all these weaken the Palestinian Authority, and they need to do some reforms, huge reforms, in order to change the norms of conduct, in order to change the organizational culture, and especially in order to create some mobility for the young people in the Palestinian Authority. But regarding Israel, I think Israel have also part in weakening the Palestinian Authority. And Israel must to supply something with a political horizon for the public in the West Bank, something that will preserve their national ambitions. So this is another thing. If to be more specific, I think we need to create a significant package, not specific one, but a much more bigger package that included relationship with Arab country and the Palestinian Authority, a package that should talk about the separation between the Israeli and the Palestinian in the end of the day. It's also important to understand what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't, we must stop the illegal outstop. We must allow the expansion of the Palestinian in a certain area. We need governance and enforcement in the Palestinian Authority against the Palestinian terror, and in the Israeli area against terror from Jewish people. So this is very important. We need to keep the Palestinian public sitting on the fence, because I must say that during Abu Mazen period of time, they just sat on were sitting on the fence and didn't initiate intifada and they weren't violent. In order to do so, we need to continue and keep the public of the people, the fabric of the life of this public. We need to separate between the settler and the Palestinian in the friction points, and we need to demand the Palestinian Authority to do, as I said before, reforms in order to increase the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority in the point of view of the public. So I would like to summarize with your permission and say that right now, when I look at the Oslo Accord, I think that progress in the political process is not possible in the near future. However, it is incorrect to say that Oslo is irrelevant. This is mainly because both people in the Palestinian arena and Israel want the same goals of separation and peace. They want to live in a good life. That's what they really want. Both people do not have the privilege to say that Oslo is irrelevant. It can and it should be relevant, mainly because it has created a reality that makes it impossible to go backwards. And this is the important thing. Oslo Accord has a role in paving the way of two-state solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi, very much. And welcome to the Washington Institute again.
Thank you.
And I want to remind everyone, if you have a question, if you're on Zoom, you could send it to the QA function if you're joining on Zoom. But if you're joining us via email or YouTube, whatever, then send it to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. One word, Washington Institute, one word, policy forum, one word, Washington Institute. Okay, our next speaker is Ghaith al-Omari. Ghaith, over to you.
All right, thank you very much, David. And it's always a challenge to come after such a knowledgeable, thoughtful colleague like Naomi. I apologize if I'm going to touch on some of the same points, but I'm going to try to frame them maybe slightly differently. And I will address 3 points. One is maybe a couple of words about history, because it's important to remember the history of Oslo. I'll try to answer the question, is Oslo dead? And I believe it's not. And then maybe a few words about where do we go from here to basically strengthen the foundations. So let me talk about history. And sometimes we find ourselves, especially given how bad things are today, almost falling to this temptation of thinking of kind of an idealistic past. That was not the case. We have to remember, and I'm talking from a Palestinian perspective here, when Oslo was signed, the Palestinian national movement was on one of its weakest points. It had reached the dead end. The PLO, after supporting Saddam in his occupation of Kuwait, found itself isolated regionally, globally, both financially, but also politically, so weak as to basically even accept the kind of anathema of having Palestinian voices represented in a joint Palestinian-Jordanian delegation in the Madrid talks. So as we talk about the history of Oslo, we have to remember that it was a moment where that it came and really saved the Palestinian national movement, or at least the organized Palestinian national movement. But more than this, I think the Oslo Agreement created two very important, related and important structures that are still with us today. One is the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, and again, it is fair to criticize it, as Neomi mentioned. It's corrupt. It is unrepresentative today. One has to say the statements of President Abbas, the anti-Semitic statements of President Abbas recently need to be condemned, etc. Yet the Palestinian Authority has also created an address for Palestinian national movement to exercise its governance and diplomatic and political functions. And for all of its shortcomings, it remains a valid address to express Palestinian national aspirations and an institutional framework that once we reach two-state solution, which I believe ultimately we need to, it will be the nucleus of a Palestinian state. The second thing that the Oslo Agreement established is the two-state solution. While Oslo itself did not mention a two-state solution, it had the logic that led us to there. Mutual recognition, the permanent status issues that we were supposed to discuss, etc. Today, a two-state solution, even though it is very far from achieving on the ground, has become diplomatic consensus, and that matters. That matters because it is the framework through which international diplomacy approaches this conflict, and frankly, it creates also counter forces to those trends and to those forces that want to collapse a two-state solution. I look at the opposition, for example, today to the settlement expansion that this current Israeli government, the diplomatic opposition, and to my mind, if the Oslo framework was not there, we would not really have the framework to exercise these kinds of breaks towards this downward slide. So I believe these were good for the Palestinian people, good for the Israelis, obviously, and for stability. And these are realities that are still with us today. Yet one would be, it would be a mistake, or one would be blind not to recognize that these two pillars, the two-state solution and the Palestinian Authority, are under extreme stress today. The Palestinian Authority is under extreme stress for a couple of reasons. One is, from a Palestinian point of view, the PA was created for one reason, to be a step towards liberation, towards ending the occupation, towards creating a Palestinian state. Well, that project so far has failed to deliver. 30 years of negotiations have not produced this, and there is a sense among the Palestinian public and among the elites as well that this is the two-state solution is really not going to happen. Failure comes with a price. Add to it the fact that policies today we see on the ground, I do believe separation is still possible, yet the policies of the current Israeli government are leading us towards a situation that separation might become impossible. A two-state solution, so the PA is under stress both for its own, for the kind of failure of the peace process, but also because of its governance. The governance style, the corruption, the closing of the political space, the turning of a vibrant body politic into something quite stagnant, the transformation of Fatah from a big tent, energetic organization to something resembling the Ba'ath Party or the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, a party that is one with the government, unable to survive outside government. These are all real threats. So as we look at these kind of threats, the real question is, where do we go from here? I believe these foundations remain, yet these foundations are under threat. So the question, where do you go from here? And here I would say maybe 3 or 4 sets of policies need to be adopted. One is, to sound like a doctor, first, do no harm. There are a set of policies today which are designed or by default would lead to a collapse of the Oslo paradigm. One is, but I mentioned that, the unchecked settlement expansion, particularly those that go deep within the West Bank, Personally, I believe all settlements are illegal and all settlements are problematic. Yet some settlements we can deal with in the context of a land swap, in an ultimate deal, the ones in the blocks, etc. And others that would really physically make a two-state solution impossible. At least one needs to take a very firm stance against those that will make it impossible to reach a two-state solution on the ground. But another real threat is policies that will lead to the collapse of the PA. If the Palestinian Authority collapses, then the idea of a two-state solution becomes impossible to achieve at the end of the day. For a two-state solution, you need a Palestinian address, and the PA is the only available Palestinian address. Hamas simply cannot be that address. It's an organization tainted with terror. I would even argue terror is part of its DNA, but it's also, as part of the Muslim Brotherhood, has zero support in the region, maybe with the exception of Qatar and Turkey, and will not have the kind of regional depth that any Palestinian movement will need. So a collapse of the Palestinian Authority would be a disaster, both for the Palestinian people, but also for the prospects of a two-state solution. It needs to be rehabilitated, partly by some of the things that Neomi mentioned, financial support, opening up the chance for achievements, but also by domestic policies, moving, rebuilding or reinitiating the institution building project that deals with the questions of corruption, effectiveness, governance, etc. The third basket of issues, while I fully agree, by the way, one point on the issue of Palestinian reform. We often hear about Palestinian reform in terms of elections. I would say we need to approach this in a very careful manner. Yes, ultimate elections are needed. Yet today, if there's an election, neither Hamas nor Fatah, and these are the only two relevant political actors today on the Palestinian arena, neither of them, if they were to lose, would accept the result, would accept the loss. And an election that fails to change reality would be worse than having no elections. So focus should be on rehabilitating Fatah, on governance, but I would be very careful with elections. Okay, the third set of issues. Do no harm is not enough. Do no harm maybe will keep you in a holding pattern, but reality is always sliding back. I believe there is need to look into some of the to look for small successes. One of the victims of the failures of the last years is that the idea of cooperation has been delegitimized. People, Palestinians and Israelis, do not believe that cooperation can do something good for them. Those of us who are older, who lived through the 90s, remember how cooperation could produce good results for the Palestinians and the Israelis. Younger people have not seen it. We have to rehabilitate this idea, and you rehabilitate it by doing things that will succeed. And I think there is a set of economic issues, territorial issues that Neomi mentioned that are concrete, will show change in Palestinians' lives, and will demonstrate to Israelis that there are Palestinians you can trust on the Palestinian side. I'm not going to go into details, but there are plenty that we can do on this front. And finally, and I will conclude with this, I believe that and I know that Dennis and David will talk more about this, but I do believe that the issue of regional integration, the idea of expanding the Abraham Accords or a breakthrough with Saudi Arabia, etc., can be a vehicle for achieving some of these objectives. First of all, I don't know if there's going to be a breakthrough between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Personally, I'm a skeptic, but the region is changing very quickly, and the region can surprise us. If it were to happen, though, I would say that this creates a great opportunity to rehabilitate some of the Oslo frameworks, both by reaffirming commitment to a two-state solution and getting the Israeli government to reaffirm that as well. But more importantly, perhaps, by looking at ways in which this integration can, in a concrete way, serve to help the lives of Palestinians, change the lives of Palestinians. Many know the trilateral agreement between Jordan, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates to use Emirati money to support Jordanian clean energy and Israeli desalination to the benefit of all three parties. I think this is a model that we can see how we can bring some of the Arab countries to do concrete projects on the ground in the West Bank in a way that, on the one hand, holds the Palestinian Authority to task and demand reform in the Palestinian Authority, B, it changes and improves the lives of Palestinians on the ground, but C, create also the possibility of a framework for Arab-Palestinian engagement, not only on high politics, but also on concrete, on-the-ground projects and policies. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Ghaith. Thank you very much. Look, I think for our listeners, it's important to understand what an earthquake Oslo was. It's 30 years, so it might sound like ancient history to some people, but it really changed the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was a point that like everyone's theory was now going to be put to the test. Here are the two national movements, and they had not dealt directly with each other. And now they were dealing quietly with each other in Norway, hence the name Oslo Accords. But now what would emerge from it was, for a lot of people, a leap into the future. And what did it mean? So I thought it would be a little different because I've done different things of lessons of Oslo. So I thought this time do it something different. And I took this 81-page declassified Israeli cabinet session. It was just declassified, I think, last week or the week before. I hadn't seen anything written about it. It's, of course, in Hebrew. And I just thought, well, that might be interesting. You know, what did we learn new? Are there things that we didn't know? There's certain things we kind of assume, but when you read it black and white, it jumps out on the page. So this is more about Yitzhak Rabin and his road. I had written this book called Making Peace with the PLO about Rabin's road to Oslo. So for me, it was, you know, it was like a mouse and cheese to, someone said, here's the historic cabinet debate that has just been declassified, 5.5 hours. So what was it like? What did we learn? So first of all, I think, you know, some things might be obvious to some, but I think it's just worth stating very quickly. Rabin was a strategic thinker. Nothing excited him more than to understand where the region was going and what were the wider implications for Israel and what could he do about it. He saw the end of the Cold War as this seismic event, and also the fact that the U.S. was willing to intervene militarily in the Gulf War as political windfalls for Israel. After all, the Soviet Union and Arab radicalism had been a nemesis for Israel, both of them. And now suddenly the Soviets have disappeared. The Gulf radicalism, kind of identified with Saddam Hussein, has been defeated, resoundingly so. And now Rabin felt you need to seize the moment. You act when you're at the top of your strength, and the other side is at its nadir. After all, Arafat chose the wrong side of the Gulf War by aligning himself with Saddam. Radical Palestinian groups had also been trained in the Eastern Bloc, East Germany, and other places. Now that had crumbled. So for Rabin, this was the ultimate kind of strategic moment, and he was determined to seize upon it. Now, on one hand, you could say, well, Palestinian terrorism was for him often second tier, like it's a nuisance, it's terrible, the loss of life, but and he was drawn more to Syria, where there's a decision maker. But Syria was a country with an air force, a conventional army. They were part of wars with Israel, 48, 67, 73. But the Syrian track did not advance as he had hoped. We could discuss that. But he felt that there was a need to deal with the neighborhood, the kind of the first circle of countries right on Israel's borders before Iran would go nuclear. He felt that this conflict of the Arab-Israeli conflict would fester. This would be fertile soil for the Iranians to go nuclear. And so he thought, I have to cool off the neighborhood. But this was kind of the link between the inner and outer circle. But it didn't mean he was oblivious to the Palestinian issue. After all, he was the defense minister for the toughest days of the first intifada. But what comes across, certainly in the transcript of the cabinet meeting that was just declassified, is, and things we kind of assume, but again, to see it black and white was, you know, how concerned he was about the rise of Hamas. He really, you know, at one point, if you remember, he took 400 Hamas people he put him on a hilltop in Lebanon, and that didn't work out the way he had hoped. He thought that would give more political space for local Palestinians, and it didn't work out. But he saw them as fanatical, not open to compromise. He sometimes called them the Khomeinism without Khomeini. I heard him maybe when I was a journalist talk about this all the time. Of course, they're not Shia like the Khomeinis, they're Sunni. But he felt, he talked a lot about how he was struck by Hamas's successes. Look, he even talked about in the cabinet meeting about the UNRWA labor elections, student elections in Bir Zaid. He felt that Hamas was like stealing a march on the PLO, and the PLO was kind of broke because they chose the wrong horse during the Gulf War. And so I think there was so then there was the question of, okay, so what do you do? And here was, I guess, for me, the first takeaway, again, seeing it on black and white, even Dennis and I have a piece just out in the Washington Post, came out online. I think it'll be in print tomorrow. But we had saw Rabin as someone who saw Oslo as reversible. But again, it's stronger when you see his words. And he says Gaza is a test case. He used the word test case in English, by the way. And for him, he thought that Israel had a good chance to block off Gaza because Gaza was closed off with the Mediterranean. Now, Rabin, this is not new to Rabin in the sense that he was a territorialist. He was of the Yigal Allon school. He was not of the Moshe Dayan kind of autonomy school. He really thought there needed to be a territorial solution. He would hope there was going to be linked with Jordan. But the relationships, of course, with Arafat and Hussein of Jordan were at best very testy. He didn't know himself whether this would work. He didn't consult with the king in advance. I think he was on a yacht in Aqaba after Oslo, where he tried to smooth it over with the king, saying, hey, in the end of the day, it's you and me, and we can help navigate this. So it's not like I have forgotten the centrality of Jordan. But I think it's clear, it points to, it's significant, this issue of reversibility, because he was the only one who talked about this in the cabinet. Nobody else talked about it. There was one that kind of hints along the Rabin line. So for all this talk of a Rabin school, not too many people were talking about how reversible this was. But it gets to the point of the sharp differences of views in defining Oslo. For the Palestinians, it was a state in waiting. For Israel and Rabin, it was a devolution of powers based on proven Palestinian security performance. Look, the doves in the cabinet, and you hear them, each one of them express themselves in this document in the 5.5-hour meeting. They saw this as the ultimate vindication of their worldview, that now the extrication of Israel from the West Bank is beginning. And Rabin, I think, saw that too. It's not that he saw that differently from them, but he was not as sure. And he felt, as the prime minister, as Mr. Security, that the devil's in the details, and he will be judged by the results, not by a worldview or an ideology of any sort. So I think the second takeaway for me of the document is that he and the doves had something in common. They all agreed the deal would stop dead in its tracks if terrorism continued and the Israeli people don't feel safe. They felt that they bet their government on Oslo. They realized this immediately. It didn't take until a few terror attacks. They realized it before the handshake in Washington. And on page 17, Rabin says, on the reversibility issue, he says if the Palestinians don't handle the terrorist element, then we need to say, gentlemen, we are taking care of security. And on the issue of that he bet his government on Oslo on page 44, he called it to be or not to be. That part was also in English. And they understood there would be a massive pushback among segments of Israeli society. So on one hand, the Palestinian terrorism was not a top tier issue for him because he was a regional thinker and he cared about Syria and Iraq and the Iranian nuclear issue. But he understood that politically, the Israeli people, the people in the street, they would judge based on how this thing, if there was terrorism or not. And they all understood that. And to the biggest of, it might be Yossi Sarid or Shulamit Aloni, they all got that. Another takeaway that comes across is how Rabin really paid a price for keeping the IDF out of the political decision-making loop. Now, did he do it because it would have leaked and Oslo never would have happened? Did he do it because he had a superior sense that he was like a supreme analyst and he didn't need the military guys? Or did he do it as a matter of principle that, that the IDF should be kept out of what he would call political negotiations? Because once you hear in the transcript, once the thing is now going to be real, he definitely wants them in. And a lot of the ministers want them in too. But I think he really, when you read the document, it really comes across that he paid a price. Why? Because with the intelligence people not part of the Oslo debate, you really see in this 5.5 hours, there's very little about the debate of the internal Palestinian politics. Little mention. Maybe they were so realized that they were into this new paradigm that they had no real way to evaluate what it meant. Basically, though, Rabin and others saw this as a capacity issue, not as a will issue. If you give the PLO the guns or whatever, they could prevail over Hamas. But are they going to use that to defeat Hamas, or is allying with Israel risky in internal Palestinian in the internal Palestinian dynamic? So I think not having the intel people meant he did the right thing as he saw it by keeping the military out, but he paid a price because he wasn't able in the cabinet meeting to really give a really good evaluation of what does this mean for the internal Palestinian dynamics. You could say nobody's going to know that because it's so new, and that's fair. But I do think that was striking what's not there. Also, is Barak. Ehud Barak is the chief of staff at this point, and he goes on and on, many, many pages about all the security problems Oslo is going to create. Now, he was in a difficult position. He's not a political figure. So as the chief of staff, he couldn't talk about the political benefits. But he went on and on about how am I going to protect every single settlement if the Palestinians are in charge of Gaza and Jericho and there's settlements nearby. And this one wants to go to judo class and this girl wants to go to ballet class. And how am I going to be able to really have a grip on what goes on the ground? Rabin didn't really, he listened and said, we're going to have the military more in the implementation, but he didn't really have good answers at this point for Barak. I would just say Rabin is explicit about Jerusalem as a deal breaker and for final status. He thought that the gap is too wide, final status will fail. In private, he's much more critical. Dennis and I were talking about this. Rabin never minced words. And he said, Camp David was a fiction. They could talk about Jerusalem in the abstract, but there was no Palestinians there. We actually have Palestinians. So it's a very different conversation. And even if you say Camp David was a template, it was clear that this was going to be very different. And he just said, there's no way. The gap is too wide between us. There were a couple of, I'll conclude with this, a couple of non-Rabin observations. It was interesting as of August 30th that they did not see Arafat as being at the ceremony. They thought it would be done by the heads of the local Palestinians in the West Bank and Eliakim Rubinstein, who was the chief negotiator. I think the ministers seemed to thought the Israeli public couldn't handle it, even though none of the ministers criticized them. They praised Rabin and Peres for doing this deal, but they only Fuad Ben Eliezer, an ally of Rabin, said, I think we should have Arafat there because he's the new partner. Let's admit it. But no one picked him up on that. So there was very little mention of what became one of the iconic photos of the 20th century, which was that handshake on the White House lawn. And the final point I'll just make here is that Rabin himself shifts a lot since the cabinet meeting of 93. If you look at the interviews, I was rereading some of the interviews he gave, like in the spring of 95. He believes much more about what are the negative consequences for Israel if there's a failure. Not that it's reversible and, oh, well, the PA had their chance, the Palestinians had their chance, and tough luck, they're out. But he felt that the Palestinian Fatah and Hamas would unite. We said if we're not capable of dealing with it and realizing that's painful, we will not achieve anything because the alternative to the peace process is its suspension. If that happens, all the Palestinian forces will unite for an enormous effort at terrorist attacks. And he seems to be coming around to the Barak view that he said at the cabinet meeting that Rabin just listened, didn't really get into, except to say, I think we could close off Gaza. But he says, I will add, and forgive me for saying this, the fundamentalist murderers will not go to heaven, but the reality of mixed populations in which Palestinians from the territories come to Israel and Israelis live in the territories over a widespread area, this reality provides thousands of Israeli targets for terror attacks daily. So it's interesting, as this is already a year and a half since Oslo starts, that instead of talking about the reversibility, I think he still hopes that Israel will do security and not get to this point. But I kind of think he goes back to his territorial roots, that this thing is too complex when you have to protect every settlement, and which security force is in charge? Is it Palestinian? Is it Israeli? How do they relate to each other? And I think he's just saying the reality just proves too many targets for attack. And I kind of think between the lines, he's saying, the reality of the mixed populations is such that you had to partition. And that is what people associate Oslo with anyway, is even though they didn't say the word two states there, it was heading in that direction of partition. But it was the interim period where there was no clear leaders of either side that he just saw more and more since that big cabinet meeting. He just saw more and more what a mess. And his views were moved over closer to Barak, although he was still faced with a political context whereby he didn't have the support. In the end, the 1995 agreement, Oslo II, where they get out of the Palestinian cities of the West Bank, he passes with one vote in the parliament, in the Knesset, and then he's killed 6 weeks later. So I can go on and on about the history. I hope if we have time, I'd like to be able to pitch it forward, but I've talked too long. I want to turn it over to my colleague, Dennis Ross.
Okay, thanks, David. It's kind of nice to follow Neomi, Ghaith, and you, because there's a present context that's been created. Now there's a historic context that's been created. And I want to deal with both, in part because I was actually there. I was our negotiator. And even though Oslo was done at a time where we were aware of it, but we weren't involved in it, obviously, I was closely involved with Rabin. I want to say a couple of things, just picking up on what you said, David, to start with. One, it's true, he kept the military out, but then once the negotiations began, he brought the military in. And they weren't just in on the periphery, they became really the central negotiators. Probably the most important negotiator on the Israeli side ended up being Amnon Shahak, who at the time was the deputy chief of staff of the IDF, became the chief of staff of the IDF. In terms of the early going, both Amnon was involved, but so was Uzi Dayan. In fact, he once called me up and berated me because I had given a set of comments about what the Israelis needed to be doing to Uri Savir, who was the putative negotiator for them. And he said, "Why didn't you call me before you talked to him?" And I said, "Am I supposed to call you every time I have an idea on the negotiations?" And he goes, "Well, talk to Uzi." And I said, "Look, either you have a lead negotiator or you don't." And he said, "Okay," he backed off. But the point is, he relied heavily on the military once the negotiations began, number one. Number two, he had himself continuing doubts about all this. And the indication of that, aside from the hesitancy at the White House in terms of shaking the hands of Arafat, because one thing about Rabin could never hide what he felt. He was someone incapable of telling a lie, and he couldn't disguise the way he felt. So it literally took President Clinton to create this kind of, using his arms to envelop the two of them to produce the handshake. But when he alerts us that there's been a breakthrough, he calls the Secretary of State, Christopher, and I'm on the line, and he says, "Look, there's been a breakthrough. Shimon Peres is going to fly out to California," because both Christopher and I were in California. This was the end of August. We were both on vacation out there. And so he says, look, wherever you need him to fly, he'll fly, and he'll come with the foreign minister of Norway, Johan Holst. And he said, but I really, they're going to come and describe this, but I want to know what you think. And the way he said it was, I'm still not sure myself. So I want to know what your views are. It was almost as if he was saying, look, I need you to sort of think this is also okay for me to proceed. And I'm not sure that was just a nicety. I think it reflected that he himself still had basic doubts. So you have someone who's coming in, he's overcoming what is a legacy of seeing Arafat through a particular lens. And now he knows, there's going to be this breakthrough. Just one note on the issue of who is going to come. We were hearing from the Israelis that, again, it was not going to be the two leaders, it would be Peres and Abu Mazen who would be signing. And I recall going in, Martin Indyk and I had to brief President Clinton at the time, and we were explaining that who would come, and Clinton basically says to us, how am I supposed to answer the question if I get at the press that Arafat's not coming? And I remember saying, well, you can say that this is what the two parties agreed to. And he goes, he sounds like what Ben Elazar, because he said, if you want Arafat to be committed to this, he has to be part of it. And when he gets the question, he goes out there and he gives the answer publicly that whoever the Palestinians want to send, which immediately meant it was going to be Arafat. That's how we ended up with Rabin and Arafat. Once it became clear Arafat was going to come, then Rabin was going to come as well. I want to pick up on a little bit of the lessons from the past before I conclude with where do we go from here. And what I'm going to say in terms of where we go from here, I'm going to pick up on some of the things that Neomi and Ghaith were saying. But in terms of some of the lessons, you mentioned, David, that the two concepts coming in were completely different. It is true that for the Palestinians, this was supposed to be a state, not yet formally, but a state with all the trappings of it. Arafat wanted this to be a demonstration that this was a different day, and Palestinians were now increasingly independent. They wouldn't see Israelis. There wouldn't be Israeli control. This was supposed to be not just a state in waiting. This was supposed to be a process that was ending occupation, and Palestinians needed to see the signs of that quickly. On the Israeli standpoint, it was totally different because there was a security preoccupation. So for Rabin, there was a devolution to a Palestinian Authority that would have to prove itself. Now, the definition of how it had to prove itself was not limited to security, because Israel was controlling all aspects of life. I recall having to deal with issues like, why was it that the Palestinians would ask me, how come we can't export cut flowers and the Israelis have to approve everything, but by the time they approve it, the flowers are dead. So how can we export them? There was again, the whole fabric of what the Israeli control was supposed to go through this gradual process. Well, that ran head on against what the Palestinians expected. And in a sense, also what the Israelis thought you had to have. Abu Allah at one point said to me, he was the lead Palestinian negotiator, he said, look, for us to take on the rejectionists, we have to show how different it is. This can't look like it's a continuation of the occupation. This has to look like something is changing. So here was something really basically fundamental in terms of the two sides having a very different approach. Second point on this, the way they interpreted language in the Declaration of Principles was a function, again, of their perception of what this was supposed to be. So in the case of, there's this famous sentence in the Declaration of Principles about how the status of the territory will not be changed during what will be the interim period. The interpretation of that was totally different. The Israelis thought, okay, the status of the territory meant that they won't declare a state and we won't annex. And Palestinians said the status of the territory won't change, meaning the Israelis won't keep acquiring more territory and establishing more settlements. So here again, there was a fundamentally different view of this. And notwithstanding all that, the two sides actually in what they negotiated, if you look at the initial Gaza-Jericho agreement, then you look at the interim agreement, they showed enormous creativity in terms of how they would deal with these different approaches. but it also did stretch out the time. No negotiation was simple. Everything became extraordinarily complicated because the starting points were so different. What they wanted to show their respective publics were so different. If I had to do it over again, I think I would have adopted certain positions, some of which I did adopt at the time, but couldn't in fact ultimately enforce. But I would have had us do a couple of things differently. For one thing, I would have made sure we didn't get involved until we sat with each side and had each side go through line by line what was in the Declaration of Principles. So we normalized their understanding of everything that was in the Declaration of Principles, because they had a Declaration of Principles, but they interpreted everything differently. And that put us at a disadvantage because we weren't part of that negotiating history. And we were so eager to get on with this because this was, as you said, David, this was an enormous psychological breakthrough. A conflict between Israelis and Palestinians is not like a conflict between Israel and Syria or Israel and any of the Arab states, because it's existential. These are two national movements competing for the same space. So it's an existential conflict. Their mutual rejection reflected this existential nature of the conflict. What Oslo represented was an end to the existential nature of the conflict because they were now mutually recognizing each other in place of mutual rejection. So that was a big deal, and we wanted to allow that to go forward. We didn't want to create impediments to it. And yet, because of that instinct, too often we didn't do what we should have done. One, we should have normalized our understandings to begin with. And two, we had to be tougher on each as it related to the actions they were each taking that was inconsistent with where they wanted to go, or at least putatively where they wanted to go. Look, on the whole issue of security and terror, our position should have been with Arafat, not just tough rhetorically. We should have said to him both privately and publicly, if we don't see you acting, we're going to stop the process. You want this process to go forward? It doesn't go forward until you demonstrate to us that you will fight terror, and you'll stop treating security and arrest like it's a revolving door. We didn't do that for a couple of reasons. One, we were worried about halting the process and what would happen if you really did halt the process. Would violence become more the norm rather than the exception? And two, by the way, because the Israelis were saying to us, you can't stop the process. So you had this reality that we were giving into, but we should not have given into when it came to terror and violence. But the same was also true on the issue of settlement. There isn't a moral equivalent between terror and settlement building, but the building of settlements did two things to the Palestinians. First, it demonstrated to them a complete lack of powerlessness. There was nothing they could do to affect what the Israelis were doing. And two, rather than showing this was a process that was going to end occupation, it seemed to be cementing it. So it discredited it. So this is kind of the backdrop and the history here. What both Neomi and Race said was, you create an address for the Palestinians with the PA, which is why it's important. And it is important to have an address for the PA, because if you don't have it, then there really is no basis in which to conduct any meaningful diplomacy. But this is also an address that is a flawed address at this point. And as we think about going forward, we have to think about what is it that can change the circumstances. Now, I focus on the potential for Saudi-Israeli breakthrough, because I don't see other moments that create the possibility to do something quite differently. And it isn't to produce an outcome right now, because there is no basis to produce an outcome. For those who want to create a Palestinian state today, you would create a failed state. We don't need one more failed state in the Middle East. But for those who think you can just continue and do nothing, then you're going to guarantee not only the loss of hope and a sense of possibility, but you're going to guarantee simply drift to a one-state outcome, which is not a solution because it's a prescription for enduring conflict between two identities who will not coexist in one state. So this moment that exists, it exists because the Saudis, for their own reasons, want to do something meaningful for the Palestinians. When I say for their own reasons, they want to show they're different. When they do it, something different takes place. So others will follow. So the big Muslim majority countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, they'll follow as well. So they have to have enough that's meaningful. It's not unrealistic what they have in mind. They want to show, A, that the realities for Palestinians will significantly change for the better. That means life gets better. That means movement gets better. That means economic prospects aren't just prospects, but there's a development of infrastructure that changes the day-to-day reality for Palestinians. They can move around through roads that get built because they have access to water in a way they don't have it now. So they want that, but they also want something else. They also want to show that they have produced an outcome that preserves two states as a possibility and as an option. Now, for that has certain implications as well. That has implications as it relates to the Israelis not expanding territorially settlements so that there isn't more territory taken from what could be a Palestinian state. And it also means the Palestinians gaining some greater authority, not just greater infrastructure in what's known as Area C, which is now actually 61.1% of the West Bank, where the Palestinians don't have economic access today and need it to be able to improve. And where you have a couple 100,000 Palestinians who now live in housing that's not legal. You have to find ways to sort of legalize that. But also you have to think about, is there a circumstance under which you turn over more territory for responsibility to the PA as a way of giving credibility? Now, the truth is, to give the PA credibility and legitimacy, it isn't just what the Israelis do, it's what the Palestinians do. This is what both Ghaith and Neomi were talking about. There has to be reform of the Palestinians for two reasons. Donors are not going to be making big investments in the West Bank unless they see the PA's governance is going to change, corruption is going to be taken on, that there's a transparency that's created so they know what's going to happen to donations and they know how and what's going to be done. And by the way, this was done before when Fayyad came in 2007 because the Bush administration insisted on him being brought in and reform taking place, and Abu Mazen acceded to that. You know, for 4 to 5 years, you had a very different functioning PA that actually was transparent and the governance was dramatically better. You need that also for another reason. You can't turn over territory to the PA unless it's going to demonstrate it can perform security-wise. Otherwise, it's not a possibility. So it can't be a case of where only the PA is getting, it also is going to have to be a case of where the PA is giving. Well, here is what's happening with the potential for a breakthrough creates the moment and to create the kind of leverage so that Israel has to make some choices. Prime Minister Netanyahu will have to prevail on ministers like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir if you're going to carry out these changes. And the Palestinians and Abu Mazen is going to have to accept that reform is going to be necessary. And that, by the way, is something that ultimately puts us in a different place. And I'll just conclude with this thought. One other broad lesson that I have from the whole Oslo process is that if the two, and Naomi, you talked about where the publics are, and you also talked about the leaders. If the leaders are not prepared to prepare their publics, very little is going to change. And when I say prepare their publics, I mean, at a certain point, you have to be open about what would be necessary for each side to have to be prepared to concede on. They have to be prepared to show they'll take big decisions by already inviting the reaction of those who they know are going to reject it. Now, you're not going to do that until you change the different environment and context for what we have. That's why you have to be able to take advantage of a moment if it comes along.
Great. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much. Let me pick up on that last point with Ghaith and Naomi, if I can, which is to what extent, you know, we talk about these different, that they came in with different definitions and different understandings of what Oslo was and what wasn't not. And I see questions we're getting in the chat. And it's no surprise because we hear these questions all the time. You know, Israel defined peace as reconciliation. Arafat, it seemed like, defined it often as decolonization, that it wasn't, this is not something you negotiate. This is, you know, we're here to make nice with Israel. We are owed this. This is how we read 242-338. This is about implementation, not about a negotiation. This is not about reconciliation. But the Israelis thought it was about reconciliation. And, you know, you could say what led that to that mindset. Was it Sadat's visit to Israel? Is it how Israelis see the word peace? How we're, maybe I'll start with you, Ghaith, on this, and then go to Naomi. What do you think this could have been different? Could the leaders have prepared their publics for what peace was and what peace was not. And look, I think it's now conventional wisdom that the second intifada of 2000-2004, the peace camp just goes off the rails and never comes back because of the violence. And so could it have been done differently, or was it inevitable it would be that way, and that the parties just had very different definitions of what this peace process was and what it was not? So Ghaith, maybe I'll start with you.
Right, thank you. Look, I mean, I think one of the, how shall I say it, genius, maybe, of Oslo is the fact that the negotiators understood what was possible and what was not possible. And they decided to go for a deal, even though there was a lot of ambiguity in there. Because I think had we waited to resolve all of these issues and reach a mutual understanding of what we're talking about, then we would never have reached the deal. So I think sometimes, you know, things like Oslo that shift trajectory become more important than having to resolve all the issues at the moment. Look, the public, I've seen the Palestinian public in terms of support or not, in terms of willingness to reconcile or not, it's really circumstantial. Circumstantial based on a couple of factors. One factor is, you know, how the health of the peace process. When the peace process was healthy in the 90s, Palestinians do believe in a two-state solution. And Palestinians were against the public, I would say here, were against terror, etc., because they felt there was a sense of possibility. When the sense of possibility goes away, then the public becomes susceptible to the kind of worse sentiment. So I think it's very hard to kind of shift public perception when reality doesn't support that. Three, leadership matters. You know, I was in Jordan when the King Hussein announced the peace with Israel. And King Hussein was someone with tremendous legitimacy in Jordan. And his message to the public was not, oh, you know, change the narrative of 60, 75 years, whatever it was then, and start loving the Israelis, because that would have not flown. His message was, do you trust me? And if you do you trust that I'm doing what's good for the country? And I think this is where, in many ways, legitimate leadership is more important than shifting the public, which is always an amorphous thing. And the final point I would say is, I've actually, with time, become more of a minimalist when it comes to this and to the peace, meaning I don't think that peace and reconciliation need to be the same thing. I can tell you my time as a negotiator, I cannot tell you how many hours we wasted, and I say wasted, on trying to reach reconciliation, common narrative, at a time when we were not ready for that. We were not ready in terms of our mindsets, and we were not ready in terms of the political reality. Today, I look at any future peace as a divorce that deals with the basics, deals with the very dysfunctional reality today. And like any divorce, great if we're friends in the future, but it's okay. It's still, even if we're not friends, it's better than a bad marriage. That said, I do not believe that we can and should ignore the narratives and the different points of view. We have to deal with them, but not in the process of negotiation, which is often a very kind of results-oriented, diplomatically, almost mechanical process, but rather through a different process that needs to come either in parallel with or after a political peace that really familiarizes both societies with the narratives of each society, not aiming to reach an agreement on the narrative or identity. That's impossible, but at least to create a sense that the other side's narrative is legitimate, even if we don't agree with it. So I don't think that you need this as part of reaching a deal, but I think you need it if you want to make the peace ultimately stable and stick for the long term.
And Ray, just to follow that up, because you were at Camp David. I'm not saying you're an intimate of Yasser Arafat, but a lot of the critics of Oslo say, look, what Arafat wanted was get his foot in the door, then make Israel's life hell to the point that Israel wouldn't be viable. And we hear this all over, and we get these questions in the chat and things like that. So I'm just wondering if you had any sense of the man about how he saw Oslo.
As you said, I cannot go into his head. He was one of the most complex people to deal with, etc. Yet, let me say the following. I think both Palestinians and Israelis sometimes tend to attribute grand design and grand planning to the other side. Yet the reality that politicians respond often to the circumstances they're in, to opportunity, risk, calculus. We've seen Arafat do things that would argue that he was completely for a two-state solution, and we've seen him do things that argue that he was not for that. I don't know what was in his head, but at least our assumption working during that period, and my assumption until today remains, that create the right set of incentives and pressures, and you would have gotten Arafat into agreeing into something. He would not have become a Zionist, obviously. He would still have his own mindset, but I think for what matters, for a negotiator, for a diplomat, I think we could have gotten him. Again, I really caution against thinking that anyone has entered the Oslo process with a big design, whether it's the Palestinians to get a foothold and attack Israel or the Israelis to gobble up more land. I believe that as both you and Dennis said when we were talking about history, there was uncertainty when you enter something like this, something that so changes a historical trajectory. I think you're open to evolution, and both, I think, Arafat and Rabin, and then later Israeli leaders had evolved based on the circumstances.
So I want to ask you, Naomi. Thank you, Raith. Just how do you see it in terms of the different definitions and expectations of what a peace process is and is not? And you were the cabinet, I'm sure, relied on you as the head of research for the Shin Bet. Like, how do you feel that could this have been done differently in your mind, where the definitions would not have been so widely divergent?
I just want to go back to your question and connect it to the current situation, because I think this is very important. I think that's why I draw it like a triangle, that you have the leadership, the public, and the actors that oppose. And I think the relationship between all these powerful center and the reaction and the relationship with Israel, this is actually organized all this, the logic, the systemic logic. But I think that we need to look now what's happened. Listen, when I think that Arafat as a leader, he didn't separate from the violent tools between, he thought that he can go in the political way, but if it's needed, he also will use the violent, the resistance tool. As opposed to Arafat, we look at Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen came and he said, and he believed, and he acted as the resistant tools is not in his basket of tools, and he just he have a lot of negative aspect, but this one something that he just all the time follow. He was against resistance and the violent tool. Now, if we look now in our situation, and so when Arafat died, it was very clear that Abu Mazen have a certain policy. Now it's a problem, because if our Abu Mazen will exit from the stage, all the nominees need to find another a kind of whether they believe, whether it's their ideas. They need to be, from one point of view, separate from Abu Mazen because each way didn't succeed. And in the other way, they need to put something in this vacuum, ideology vacuum, because the resistance didn't succeed, and also the political way didn't succeed. So what is the other way? It can be or struggling, or can be chaos, or can be join the Hamas, which is very important for Israel, that this won't be the idea of the next leader in the Palestinian arena. So we need that the people, as Dennis said, leader must build the narrative with his people, but you also have to be much more clear and much more believe that this is the only tool to have the politics way and not the resistant way.
David, can I pick up?
Yeah, could I want you to also, if we could pitch it forward too, Dennis. So, all right, go ahead.
That's what I was going to do.
Let me pitch it forward if I could for you, because to pick up what you said before, and I think we all agree with Naomi that the legacy of nonviolence could be discredited if Abbas leaves the stage and there's nothing to show. But but to go pitch it forward on the Saudi issue, Dennis, that you talked about, and you look, I was over there in July, August, and I told you, I felt some good news and some not as good news. The good news was that I felt on being in Ramallah, the Palestinians were not where they were with the Abraham Accords when it comes to Saudi Arabia. They understood that they played that hand badly in 2020. They're still paying for their collision with Mohammed bin Zayed, the leader of the UAE. Also, to be fair, the Saudis are the bigger boy on the block, so to speak, in comparison to the UAE too. So even if they didn't play that badly, but I don't think they want to be seen as obstructionists. On the other hand, as you kind of alluded to, Dennis, there's a sense that if there's a Saudi deal, it's not going to be transformational, but maybe it could shift the trajectory. We haven't mentioned the word Smotrich and how he clearly wants to, I think he wants to get rid of the PA and he clearly wants to annex. So this could be something that could shift that trajectory. And the question is how do you do that in a way that, the other takeaway I had, which was not as positive, frankly, is the whole idea of land transfers from Israel looks much bleaker with this government. And I'm not convinced that it's just, if I thought it was just Smotrich and Ben Gvir, 14 seats, and I'd say, well, you have Gantz, even though he says no, maybe it's a yes, so it's 12 in. And then it's 62. 62 is you need 61 to be a majority. But, he's 5 of his 12 are right wingers. The Likud, I counted heads in the parliament, 9 of them are closer to Smotrich and Ben Gvir than they are to Bibi. So this is not going to be easy, the idea of land transfers. You want to leverage another historic process, just like 93 was the beginning of this, what I call the earthquake, of a historic reconciliation. But how do you do it when the domestic dynamics in both camps are very complex and they don't lend itself to easy solutions that you could just kind of easily fit it in so smoothly? So Dennis, what do you think?
Well, I think it gets back to Naomi's point about leadership. If you have a historic moment, are you going to rise to that moment or not? If you miss this moment, I don't know that you're going to have another one that comes along. And actually, it relates very well to the last thing Naomi said about what comes after Abu Mazen. If Abu Mazen's way looks like it's completely failed, so you're not going to simply embrace that. So what are the alternatives you have? Well, the alternatives don't look very good. But what if you've taken advantage of this moment? What if, in fact, there is a significant change on the ground? Not one that's producing 2 states, but one that changes the realities day to day that Palestinians feel, and one that at least preserves the possibility of 2 states. Then you basically restored the sense of possibility. If when Abu Mazen goes, there's no sense of possibility, then you're playing into Hamas's hands, or you're playing into those who feel they either join with Hamas or they have to compete with Hamas by being violent. If you don't want that to be the future, and you have a moment, then you have to be prepared to make a decision. Is it easy? Absolutely not. Do the politics line up in either place right now? No. The politics are hard. Although I will say the politics of this government are hard. I'm not as sure that the politics in Israel, given the kind of upheaval we've seen with this awakening, I'm not sure that the politics as we've known them in Israel for the last decade are the same as they've been. And everyone may have to rise to that moment. Maybe the opposition has to rise to that moment too, because of what's at stake. It's not just what's at stake in terms of, okay, we're going to have this breakthrough and here's what we'll do with the Palestinians. Naomi's point, which I think is something that it requires repeating, because it's not that we haven't heard it before, but I'm not sure that there's a recognition of the implications of it. If Abu Mazen's leadership looks like it's failed on every level, it means the whole idea of violence, by the way, as a tool, is legitimized. It means that the idea of negotiations as a pathway are delegitimized. Now, he hasn't been a champion of pursuing these things in a highly credible way. But if there is a vacuum after him, and there's a vacuum even ideologically of what you stand for, what is the Palestinian national movement? Today, what is the idea that animates the Palestinian national movement? I'm not sure I know what it is. And I'm not sure that at this point they know what it is. That's kind of what you were getting at.
Yeah.
So we should also look at the context that exists for Palestinians in the future and the pathway they're going to adopt in the context of thinking about what are the decisions that have to be made if there is a breakthrough, what is possible on the Palestinian side, but therefore, what is it that the Israeli prime minister will have to do? It is not going to be simple, because you're right. The Likud is not this is not the Likud party that many of us have known over the years. When Benny Begin is someone who doesn't have a place in the Likud party, you realize the Likud party has changed. So we have to be mindful of that, but also there is a big decision that probably has to be made, and some hard choices that have to be made if there is a breakthrough that offers to really transform the geopolitics of the Middle East and beyond.
Well, there's so much to discuss, and I know we're going to be revisiting the Saudi dimension initiative with the Palestinian dimension to that initiative soon. Maybe I'll end with something I see in the chat. Our friend, dear friend, historian Ken Stein at Emory, who has written about a lot of this, where he said agreements are often, he's quoting Sam Lewis, who was at the Washington Institute and was a great American, a great U.S. peace negotiator, a friend to all of us, I think it's fair to say, a colleague. And he said, agreements most often use ambiguous terms intentionally where both sides could continue their own interpretations when they leave the negotiations. But the question is sometimes we're looking for that transformational leadership that he or she would shift that narrative. That's not easy. Look, there's so much to delve into. I would just urge people to keep reading what we're putting out at the Washington Institute. We'll be putting out a lot of things on Oslo at 30, and we'll be delving into the Saudi initiative of the Biden administration and what it means for Israel, for the Saudis, for the Palestinians, for the Middle East. So all I could say is I want to thank my co-panelists, Neomi Neumann, Ghaith al-Omari, Ambassador Dennis Ross, and just urge you, thank you for staying tuned, and